Good afternoon. I am Shirlethia Franklin, partner in the Washington office of Jones Day and a member of the firm's Constitutional Policing and Civil Justice Reform Task Force. And joining me as our co-moderator for this afternoon's webinar is another member of the firm's Constitutional Policing and Civil Justice Reform Task Force, my partner, Andy Luger, who is in our Minneapolis office. I will bring Andy on shortly and give a more proper introduction of him at that time. But on behalf of Jones Day, we would like to welcome you to our program titled Transforming the Minneapolis Police Department, a collaborative approach to driving systemic and cultural change. And we thank you all so very much for being open and willing to participate, listen, and engage in this critical discussion about policing during this pivotal and urgent moment in our country. This program is scheduled to run from 2 p.m. to 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time. The program is being recorded and you will be in listen-only mode throughout the presentation. If at any time you have a question, you may submit them through the Q&A window located on the right side of your screen. Today, you will hear from a number of very distinguished national and local experts and leaders who will draw on their experience in driving police reform to discuss how the community, you, can bring about systemic and sustaining cultural change in the Minneapolis Police Department. Those leaders include Ron Davis, partner at 21CP Solutions, former police chief, and former director of the United States Department of Justice's Office of Community-Oriented Policing Services, the COPS office, during the Obama administration. Also joining us is Carol Mason, president of John Jay College of Criminal Justice, former Assistant Attorney General at the Department of Justice's Office of Justice Program, also during the Obama administration, and former partner at a national Atlanta-based law firm. And we are so happy to be joined by three Minneapolis experts who've been working in this space for quite some time. First is Tony Adams, Minneapolis police officer for more than 30 years and program coordinator for the Minneapolis Police Activities League. We are also joined by Carl Benson, president of the Minnesota Black Chamber of Commerce and manager of operations for one-to-one law enforcement mentoring course at Metro State University. And last but certainly not least is PJ Hill, community leader, financial advisor with Wells Fargo Advisors, and former professional basketball player. And now I would like to give a more proper introduction to my partner and co-moderator of today's webinar, Mr. Andy Luger, who is one of my absolute favorite Minnesotans, and Andy, whom many of you on this webinar know extremely well. Andy is a partner in our Investigations in White Collar Defense practice group. Andy and I are both former Obama administration alum, and Andy having served as the United States Attorney for Minnesota from 2014 to 2017. Andy is currently leading Jones Day's constitutional policing reform efforts on the ground there in Minneapolis, and has been doing a fantastic job leading our efforts. And like our panelists, he's worked in this space for quite some time. So Andy, thank you so much for all that you've done, and thank you for all you continue to do in this space. And I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Shirlethia. And thank you, everybody who is listening today. For each of us, the murder of George Floyd just about 1 month ago was devastating. For 8 minutes and 46 seconds, we watched a police officer, a white police officer, kill an unarmed African-American man before our eyes. In the heartbreaking weeks since, we have grieved with George Floyd's family, with his neighbors, and with the community. And we have been inspired by the outpouring of rage and frustration, not just here in Minneapolis, but throughout the world, and the demand that we, all of us, address systemic racism. I've been investigating police misconduct for decades and have been outraged too many times. As a prosecutor in New York, as the outside investigator of the Metro Gang Strike Force, and as United States Attorney for Minnesota, I have seen the dire consequences of systemic racism. I have seen officers abuse their positions of trust with corruption and violence. But I have also been proud to work beside officers who serve with courage and integrity, officers who protect and serve in the highest traditions of their calling, And I have known so many officers who call out misconduct and who want to bring about positive systemic change. Over the past few weeks, Shirlethia and I, along with our colleagues at Jones Day, have listened to the clear and forthright messages of protesters, community leaders, and police officers who have demanded three things. First, that we are beyond the word reform, that we must do more. Today, as all of them have made clear, we must transform the Minneapolis Police Department and change its culture. We must finally address deep-seated racism. Second, that we need to reimagine what policing should be in Minneapolis and ask the tough questions about what we want from our department and what type of officer we want serving in our communities. And third, that we must do this together if it is ever going to succeed. As so many have stated, the community must be at the forefront of this drive to transform the department, and the community should have the voices and support of officers who also desire a new culture, who want to work in a department that all can be proud of. Transforming, reimagining, and collaborating. These are the themes we will discuss on today's webinar. This afternoon, you will hear from speakers steeped in the movement for change, who will address why this is necessary and how we together can get there. We will discuss everything from the recruitment and education of prospective officers to the recent publication of an open letter from current Minneapolis police to the community. We will talk about how culture drives change, and we will watch a video of officers committed to a humane form of policing engage in real-life de-escalation. We will learn how policies that save lives and humanize the practice of public safety can become the cornerstones of a police department under a culture and vision of policing that stresses problem solving, not simply arrests. Today's webinar is the first in a series that Shirlethia and I and our firm will bring to the issues of transforming the Minneapolis Police Department. We begin today with an emerging local leader, PJ Hill. PJ?
How you doing, Andy?
Thanks, PJ.
So, first of all, I want to thank you and Shalisa and Jones Day for letting me be a part of this webinar. Just a little bit of background about me. I have deep roots here in the Minneapolis community. I'm third generation in this community. I was born and raised in South Minneapolis, graduated from Minneapolis North, went on to attend Ohio State University, played basketball there, then went on to play professional basketball for a little under a decade, and then transitioned into, moved back to Minnesota and transitioned into wealth management. And, you know, I'm living in the community 2 blocks from where George Floyd was killed. And that day, you know, something changed for me as we all witnessed the slow, torturous, 9-minute murder of a man. I think something inside of all of us broke. It doesn't matter if you're black or white, rich, poor, man or woman. Something inside of everybody across America broke. And, you know, we said enough is enough. And that thus began my journey of, you know, transitioning from a community leader to more of an activist and standing on the front line. And how do we, number one, rebuild our community? And number two, you know, police reform in the way that the police police the community in the way we feel like as a community they should, you know, police us. I think, you know, my experience with police has been twofold. I grew up in a program called the Police Athletic League, PAL. Tony Adams was one of my coaches. I had other coaches, Charles, Officer Owe. So at a young age, I had very positive interactions with police. And when I would see these officers when I grew up at different events, I felt as if the community was policing the community. I never looked at it as the police force was just policing us. I thought they were protecting and serving us. But then as I started to get older, I had other experiences with the police would just be pulling me over, very negative experience with the police. And it wasn't until they would actually see my driver's license and who I was that their tone would be different. So I think that that inconsistency comes with the culture of the Minneapolis PD. And I think that culture is what needs to be reformed. And when we talk about reformed, I think there has to be a common ground from what us, the community, and community leaders, and me as a member of the community, feel, and how the Minneapolis police feel that they should police. And there's got to be that common ground where we meet in the middle. And that's what I, have stood for and continue to fight for. I'm able to articulate not only for members of the community, but churches and all the people in this Minneapolis. How do we find that common ground? I think there is a eagerness from not only leaders but also the police to find that common ground and make change.
PJ, a lot of the people who are listening and watching today really don't have access to the police officers that you're talking to and the community leaders. Can you just inform people what you're hearing about willingness to have those conversations between community leaders and police officers about how to bring about change?
Yes. So I've been in plenty of meetings with community leaders, pastors, church leaders, people who have been in this, what we call this fight for a long time. And me being in the younger generation, I do a lot of listening, a lot of trying to understand where they come from. And it's an eagerness. Everybody says this time is different. I also have friends who are on the Minneapolis Police Department and other leaders like Tony Adams, who I've spoke with. I was in a room full of officers, and they approached me, reached out to me, and they said, how do we make this right? How do we change things? So I think on both sides, people see that that things are not right, and how can we find this common ground to move not only the police department forward, but to heal as a community and take that next step forward.
The final minute or so, can you just talk about whether you're hopeful that this can come about, and what are you asking of the people who are listening today?
I'm very hopeful. I'm very hopeful that that there can be a change. Obviously, we stand on the back of the greatest generation. My grandparents, my parents, they have made a lot of sacrifices, broke a lot of barriers. A lot of change has happened. So I believe it will be now this generation's legacy to really make profound change and really move the ball forward. And that could be our generation's legacy. This is our moment, all of our moment, to really change the narrative. And I'm very hopeful. And, my call to action for everybody is let's all lean in together and do the next right thing.
Thank you, PJ. And at the end, so for everybody who is listening, at the end of this presentation webinar, we'll have email addresses for the speakers so you can reach out to them individually. PJ, thank you so much. Shirlethia, turning it back over to you.
Thank you, Andy.
Thanks, Andy. And PJ, thank you so much for being an example and for sharing your story. I will now like to bring on Mr. Carl Benson. Carl is the president and CEO of the Minnesota Black Chamber of Commerce. Carl, welcome.
Thank you.
All right, we're so happy to have you here. And Carl is actually the manager of operations of the one-to-one law enforcement mentoring course at the Metro State University. And Carl, can you just talk to us about the police training work you're doing and how you even came to this space as a business leader?
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you again for having me. One-to-One Connect, we are a leader. We're a leader in developing school-based mentoring programs, both in Minneapolis and St. Paul. And 10 years ago, we realized that we were doing a pre-service law enforcement, working with pre-service law enforcement students who were mentors to our middle school students. So what we were looking at then and there was trying to figure out an experience that included law enforcement and law enforcement students in a process that sort of gave them a up close and personal touch with the communities in which they're going to serve. So we looked at it a couple different things. From the standpoint of looking at the students themselves, we were looking at a cultural change is needed in the department, in the police departments. And this happens long before the recruits become brought into the department and hired by the police forces. What we were looking at is to see where the educational process hit. And what we were finding with students were that the law enforcement students, were not necessarily understanding of what justified good behavior and bad behavior in police. The students were quick to justify the bad behavior because of something that the accused did versus something that they were doing. Law enforcement students also talked and had this hero mentality, of which that they viewed the law enforcement is a more of a less empathetic than they should be, and it was all about sort of enforcement. And then at the same time, students were they didn't value the education around implicit bias and understanding the cultural differences in the neighborhoods they're going to serve. So right away, we sort of, and this wasn't all students, but at the same time, there's a number of students that we saw these kind of traits in that we were starting to be really curious about. So one piece of work that we did with the Brooklyn Park Police Force in Minnesota is we put together a community consensus workshop, and we brought together police, students, college students, law enforcement students, professors, community members, community leaders. We put them all in the room together and said, we need to come together and figure out what core competencies do we need in our community of Brooklyn Park? What are the police saying? What are the community saying? And what would those core competencies be? And through that whole process, which is a 2-day process, we came together and we said, these are the core competencies. And what they ended up being from the group was empathy, effective communication, cultural understanding and openness, commitment to the core policies of policing and the values of policing, attentive and active listening, commitment to personal development, consistent and authentic engagement in the communities, and respectful and humble service. And we virtually built our course at Metro State around those core competencies. So what our thought process is, and what we still believe to this day, is that if police forces or police officers coming out of school and going into the force have these core competencies, they will have an upper hand in community policing that most officers would not have. So what we really hope ultimately is that we get to that place.
That's great. So, Carl, there's so many people like you who were not in policing, right, or have not been in this space. So many business leaders and community leaders who just want to get involved and do something in this space, especially now, given this time in our country. What advice would you have for people who have no idea where to start and how to create a program as successful as the one you've created? What can
Right.
they do to?
Yeah, I would. I know that my email address will be attached later on, but certainly reach out to us if you're in Minneapolis. But if you're in a community other than Minneapolis, what we really ask of everyone is to sort of reach out to the communities that are doing this work. So you'll have to look and do a little bit of research. Clearly, you have to educate yourself a little bit, but find the right communities, whether it's PJ, myself, or Tony, and figure out where you can get involved with the police at a community level, being able to listen to the community. And that's really first and foremost. If you're not doing that, if you're not getting the voice of the community in the process, there's literally no way to reform police anywhere in the country without that.
Absolutely. And finally, quickly, for folks who wonder, do programs like this even work, right? What lessons have you learned in terms of making sure that programs like these are actually effective?
Oh, we believe they are effective because we've proven it to be that case. The consensus workshop that we put together, we brought together 200 people with those police forces in Brooklyn Park, and we were able to sit down, and everyone was able to put their guard down. Not only the community and the community activists, but the police officers as well. So we know that if we have that opportunity and everyone comes in with an open mind, being able to listen to the power dynamics in the room, saying that the police have no more power than a 12-year-old boy, I think those are the situations that allow everyone to be human, build empathy, and have that opportunity to grow.
Great. Thank you so much, Carl. That's fantastic work you're doing, and keep it up. We're
Thank
so proud to have you on the front lines down
Thanks.
there. All
Thanks a
right,
lot.
now we will turn it back over to Andy.
I want to let you know that the next speaker will be Tony Adams, a police officer for about 30 years. And he's been a friend of PJ Hill and a friend of mine for many years. Before we turn to Tony, however, I'd like to read a letter, an open letter that was written by a number of Minneapolis police officers shortly after the murder of George Floyd. And if we can put that up on the screen, I'll read it out loud. This is a Minneapolis open letter written to the community on behalf of a number of officers. And I'm going to ask Tony in a minute, I'm going to ask you some questions about it. We wholeheartedly condemn Derek Chauvin. We are with you in the denouncement of Derek Chauvin's actions on Memorial Day 2020. Like us, Derek Chauvin took an oath to hold the sanctity of life most precious. Derek Chauvin failed as a human and stripped George Floyd of his dignity and life. This is not who we are. We are with you and want to communicate a sentiment that is broad within our ranks. We ask that our voices be heard. We are leaders, formal and informal, and from all ranks within the Minneapolis Police Department. We're not the union or the administration. We are officers who represent the voices of hundreds of other Minneapolis police officers. Hundreds. We acknowledge that Chief Arredondo needs each of us to dutifully follow him while he shows us the way. We stand ready to listen and embrace the calls for change, reform, and rebuilding. We are with you moving forward. We want to work with you and for you to regain your trust. Tony, if you could come online, I'll ask you a few questions about your history with the department, and then maybe we can talk about the letter itself. Tony, let me ask you this. Can you just describe to the listeners here how long you've been with the department and a little bit about your history with the department?
Thank you, Andy, and thank you for everybody who's participating in this very important cause today. I have been with the Minneapolis Police Department for 30 years, and in those 30 years, I started out in the patrol unit until Officer Hoff was assassinated in 1992. From there, I moved to the gang unit to try to dismantle the gangs in the Minneapolis area. From there, I started working on Minneapolis narcotic unit. I worked there for a number of years, and I worked out of your former office, Andy, on several different occasions. From there, I went back to my old high school as a school liaison officer. Right now, they're referred to as the school resource officers. And that's where, like PJ talked about, PJ's from North High School. I'm from North High School. And I've known PJ since he wasn't even born, pretty much. I grew up with his father at the age of 6 years old. So his grandmother used to babysit me and my brothers when we grew up in the north side of the projects area. I went to school with his mother. She was an outstanding track runner at that time. So when I went back to the high school, Andy, it was an awesome ideal for me to get back to go back to my old high school and work as a police officer, because I had all these individuals that I now had the opportunity to monitor and watch over and to make sure that they became productive individuals. After the high school, I worked for DEA, the Drug Enforcement Task Force. I worked there for several years, and I prosecuted a lot of cases, again, when you were a prosecuting attorney and when you was a U.S. attorney. From DEA, I worked downtown patrol, and one of the more noticeable things that I did in my 30 years is worked a serial killer case with Michael Prophet over north, where he was killing a lot of people and dumping them in Theodore Worth Park, and also some other high-profile cases. So I've been pretty busy in 30 years, and I've now landed for the last 8 years in the Police Activity League, like PJ talked about. And in this, it's a nonprofit organization within the police department that allow us as officers to go out and recruit kids and have them play sports and activities and be mentors and to be strong role models for these young individuals.
Let me ask you, Tony, you've been around a while. You've seen the ups and downs of the department. In terms of reform, I just read a letter from a number of officers, and it repeats the refrain, "We are with you." Tell me your experience in working with the community and your thoughts about the number of officers in the department who do want to see the kind of transformational change that we're talking about.
Exactly. That is my job in its entirety. We have a number of different departments that work with the community on a daily basis. So I don't go out and answer 911 calls anymore. I haven't done that for quite some time. My job is to recruit kids and to deal with their parents to be a part of my program. Again, I see, like PJ talked about, I see it as police officers coaching kids in the community that they're growing up into. And then when we're dealing with those kids, they look at us totally different. They don't look at us as police officers anymore. They look at us as Coach Tony or Coach Paul or whatever the case may be. So that brings a very positive aspect to not only that child but also to that parent. As you talked about, there's no officer that I have found on this department that will say that what happened that night to Mr. Floyd was acceptable. We've all said this was disgusting and unacceptable. We had just had training probably within the last 4 or 5 months that specifically told us that we are not to be kneeling on nobody's neck, that we are not to be laying on nobody. So we just had this training and we were just refreshed on this. So when we all watched that video, we all watched it in disgust.
So, Tony, listening to this webinar and participating in it are a number of community leaders, business leaders, citizens of Minneapolis. What do you say to them about the prospect for police officers who want cultural change meeting with and working with community leaders to bring about that kind of change? Are you hopeful for that? Do you think that that's something we can do?
I am very hopeful. I think that that's very accomplishable. I think we just have to make sure that it aligns with what's policy, what's city law, what's state law. But I do see a department that should make change, and we have been talking about this for 30 years. And when I talked to you probably several weeks ago, Andy, I talked about the fact that I've been around a lot of critical incidents in my 30 years. The one thing that I've always saw, and what I told you is, I don't want to see people just talk about it and then 4 or 5 months down the road, ignore it and act like it never happened. We need to keep having conversation. We need to keep having dialogue, and we need to keep this meeting process going so we can make sure that reform is sticking, or those changes that are coming, that they're going to stay. Because if we just drop it after 6 months, it doesn't do any of us any good to go back to the next critical incident and try to start this process all over again.
Thank you, Tony. Now, at the end of this webinar, we're going to be putting up everybody's email addresses. I take it you'd be willing to take emails and engage in dialogue going forward after today's webinar with people who are participating and learning from today's presentation.
Absolutely. I have no problem with that.
And the letter, final question for you, Tony, the letter that I just read that was published in the Star Tribune that came from a number of officers said that they speak for hundreds. Do you agree with that? Do you know hundreds of officers who you believe will participate in conversations about reforming the culture and transforming the culture of the police department?
Absolutely. And if not, I think that we probably can get more than just the hundreds. I know when that letter was drafted and displayed or sent out, that they were only dealing with a certain number of individuals that wanted to sign it or want to have their name attached to it. But again, from me working on a day-to-day basis and being around this, I think the vast majority of the department will sign that letter.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you for participating in this webinar. I appreciate your help and I appreciate your dialogue. Shirlethia?
Thanks, Andy. And Tony, thank you so much for your service and your tireless efforts in advancing community policing in Minneapolis, and really for speaking to the fundamental essence of humanity and compassion, which is needed when engaging with community. Before we bring on our next two speakers, I will note that we are receiving a number of questions in the Q&A field, which is great. So please keep them coming. We will try to incorporate some of the questions in our questions to the panelists. But if we don't get to each of your questions, we can always follow up with you afterwards, or you can email the inbox that we will put up at the end of this. So please keep them coming, and we will make sure to address as many as we can. All right, well, now we are very fortunate to be joined by two people who have really dedicated years to transforming policing in this country, quite frankly. Ron Davis and Carol Mason, and I'm going to pause a second so they can get on the screen and see when I embarrass them. Hi, Ron and Carol. I will hi. I will admit that selfishly, just seeing you and all three of you actually on this screen together just brings so much joy to my heart and great memories of our time in the Obama administration. And Carol and Ron, I know that you worked sun up and sun down on advancing both constitutional policing and community policing for Attorneys General Holder and Lynch, which was also a big priority of President Obama. So I'm very happy to see you both here. But I must candidly say, seeing you here also makes me a bit frustrated, right? To know that all of the work that folks put into this very same issue, yet we're right back here. And so while I wouldn't dare be arrogant or naive enough to think that we'd somehow eradicated all the policing issues, I really had hoped that we would have seen more progress. But we're hopeful that people like you and Tony and Carl and PJ are continuing in that fight to advance policing in the country. And so we talked about some of the work that you've done at the Department of Justice, but I thought it'd be helpful just to level set a bit and give a bit of background about the foundation that has been laid in this space. As we all know, this is not a new issue, right? We're not coming to this issue for the very first time. And so if you could just give a bit of background about your work, particularly in the Obama administration, and Ron, would love first for you to talk about the work with the 21st Century Policing Task Force, just briefly, and Carol, for you to talk about the National Initiative for Building Community Trust and Justice. All right, Ron?
Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. And once again, let me thank Jones Day for setting up this webinar. I think these kind of discussions are just extremely beneficial. My work in the Obama administration was twofold. One was the director of the COPS office, which is all about community policing. You made that introduction, working with some over 16 to 18,000 law enforcement agencies to help incentivize best practices, advance community policing, support things like research and development of best practices. And so that work has been ongoing during the entire Obama administration. But if you remember, in 2014, following the Michael Brown tragedy, and then Eric Gardner, President Obama put together a task force on 21st century policing. And I think the beauty of the task force, he said, there were 11 people that were picked external to the government, civil rights leaders, academics, a couple of people right from the lines of marching on the street. So demonstrators, really community leaders, and law enforcement. And he said, look, I'm going to give you 90 days to really go around the country and give us some best practices on how we can start really addressing this issue of police reform, but building trust and legitimacy, while also making sure that we continue to get the kind of crime reduction we're looking at. So the great thing with 90 days is obviously we were not a think tank. He wasn't looking for our personal opinions as much as to tap to the field and find out what's working from people that are actually doing it. So talking to grassroots leaders, police departments, unions, chiefs, academics, and we gave him a series of recommendations that for the remaining of the administration, many agencies were adopting. We put several $100 million of grants behind it. I'll let Carol talk about her billions of dollars of grants. Mine was small compared to hers. Anyway, we put $700 million of grants behind it to really incentivize it and get it going. And I think a lot of departments had embraced it and some are continuing today. But it really just talks about some core things of policing. I just heard the gentleman from Minneapolis, which was very impressive, for 30 years, talk about building trust and legitimacy and providing those kind of services to the community.
Okay, it's like old times to be with the four of you all again. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this conversation. It's an important conversation, and for those of you who don't know, Andy and Ron will attest to this. Shrelithia, who was in the Deputy Chief of Staff to the Attorney General and ran her policing reform work, we met weekly with her to discuss these issues. So it is feeling like old home week again. But I want to say I'm so glad that Minneapolis is focused on this conversation. One of the things you talked about was the National Initiative for Building Community Trust and Justice. As Ron mentioned, after the Trayvon Martin incident and well before Michael Brown, I got a letter as the Assistant Attorney General. I got a letter from the then president of John Jay College of Criminal Justice, signed by many researchers who worked in this field of police reform, to say there is work that the Justice Department can do and should do. And so we took this 5-page letter, and as Ron will remember, I cobbled together money, thank you, Ron, to create the National Initiative to Build Community Trust and Justice. And what we wanted to do was to take the principles of procedural justice, implicit bias, and racial reconciliation, which there's a lot of research about the efficacy of this work, but what there wasn't a lot of is what if you bring them all together? And so we brought those principles together. John Jay happened to be the lead grantee recipient on that, but they were working with Yale, with Tracy Mears and Tom Tyler on the procedural justice piece, and Phil Goff, who's now also at John Jay, on the implicit bias piece, and David Kennedy with the racial reconciliation piece. And as I mentioned, we started this work well before Michael Brown, but we announced it shortly after all of the Ferguson issues. So people thought for once that the federal government moved quickly. We didn't. We'd been working on it for a year. And I say that to say that this work takes time. It's not going to happen overnight, but I loved it when Carl and PJ and Tony all talked about a commitment, a long-term commitment to this work, because it may not happen. It'll take some time to make this work. So Minneapolis, thankfully, was one of our pilot demonstration sites. And I say thankfully because even though this incident happened that we all universally agree was horrible, was wrong, and represents the worst of what we all want to see in policing, there are some things that happened as a result of Minneapolis being part of that racial reconciliation, implicit bias, and procedural justice training. So for about 4 years, 3-4 years, Minneapolis and the community, every sworn officer and every civilian person in the Minneapolis Police Department, and your current chief was our principal liaison for this work, were engaged and engaging with the community and how do we do this work and how do we change the culture of what's happening in our police departments using research to do that. But what happened with George Floyd shows us how hard this work is. But we can never give up. Just because it's hard and we didn't succeed with 4 people doesn't mean that the work doesn't work. And so for me, I'm glad to be part of this in Minneapolis in particular, because it has been the focal point of a lot of work. And I think because of that foundation that exists in Minneapolis, and as demonstrated by the 3 panelists who were on here, that you've got a strong community commitment to doing some long-standing hard work that has to be done to impact the culture of what people think about policing.
Thank you, Carol. I want to talk about the issue of culture. Ron and Carol, you've both spoken about this, you've written about it, and recently you've taught me a great deal about how culture is as important, if not more important, than policies and programs and training. That without the right culture, the policies really don't carry much weight. Ron, could you tell the listeners a little bit about your experience with the need for the right culture in a police department, not just the right policies?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Andy. Let me describe culture this way, because this is where I think a lot of confusion exists. And that is, policies tell officers or tells the community what the officer is required to do. Culture is really what they are doing, what they're expected to do, and what they receive satisfaction or reward or acknowledgement to do. In many cases, those two do not align. And so we need to have proper policies and training. But if there's not the accountability piece, which means here's the policy, you're trained on how to do it. Now you're giving value when you actually do it. If you don't do it, you're held accountable for not doing it. That sustained over time creates a culture. So that now when certain things happen, the expectation, the culture demands, some people call it tradition. If you traditionally ignore misconduct, then that is setting that the new policy is not the one that's against misconduct. It's the culture that says that this is okay, because if you do it, nothing will happen to you. So when you start looking at a reform, and I think Carol alluded to this very well, you may go through a process. The first stage is going to be policy changes. You got to get those policy changes. In some case, legislation is required to set the base of it. Then you have to train to it. But over the next few years, you have to hold people accountable. And accountability is twofold, Andy. Is one, you hold people accountable for not meeting it. And two, when people do meet it, you acknowledge, you reward, and you give positive feedback so that people inside the department know what's expected. If I do this, then I'll get the professional rewards that I do for doing my job well. If I don't do it, that I'm going to be held accountable. And part of that would be I'm not only be held accountable from a sergeant, lieutenant, or captain, but held accountable for the organization, because once the culture is set, then that means everybody, like you heard from Tony, people like Tony inside the department, that they themselves will walk up to you as a peer saying, that's not acceptable for us. You're tainting the badge. You're ruining our reputation. We don't like this. That's when you know you have the culture. So, but that can take some time. That takes an investment, that takes sustaining it, and it takes the acknowledgement that the current culture is probably flawed. And that's why they call things systemic challenges. But once you understand culture and you start changing the culture, it outlasts. Here's what I would say in closing. A positive culture outlasts individual chiefs. So as a former police chief, what I want to see when I leave the organization, if the culture is strong enough and I help build it, that the department gets better than when I left, because all it keeps doing is seeking to learn. It's a learning organization. It sets higher and higher standards. It's the same thing if the chief comes in and is relatively negative, that the culture should push back, right? Because now the culture inside the department wants high standards. The culture involves the mayor, the elected officials, so that no one person can come in and tear down the organization. All they can do is be part of the culture to keep building it up.
Carol, you've actually talked a lot about the importance of creating an environment of cultural change. Tell us about that from your perspective. How can one create that environment?
Thank you. Thank you. You saw me taking notes because I'm always writing down what Ron says, because it's always very insightful and helpful. And running a college that educates so many future law enforcement officers, this is educational for me as well. But I think that I think what's important in creating a culture is hearing from people. Tony alluded to it. Carl alluded to it earlier. PJ talked about his experience of being one of those voices being heard. I think it's important, even when you're talking about institutional change, not just change in the community, that the leaders of the department need to spend the time hearing from the officers as well as from the community and engaging people in conversation, because people, when we talk about procedural justice, it's not just procedural justice in terms of how they relate to the community, but it's also how they are treated internally within the department. And so, as Ron mentioned, you've got to change the culture internally. And if people see that there's a policy, but how it's observed and who gets rewarded is not consistent with the policy, then you don't have procedural justice internally. And if an officer is walking around having that disconnect with what he's being told to do internally in the institution, and then going out to work in the communities with that dissonance between, what they think the policy is and what's really happening, you got to align all of it internally and externally. And so I think that as I said, it's hard work and it takes time to spend time hearing from your officers about what are the issues, what are the challenges, what are the problems that they're experiencing that cause them the challenge. So we know in Minneapolis that two of the officers were very new on the force, and their articulated rationale in the press is they didn't feel as if they could speak up. Well, that's a culture change that has to happen, so that, and I want to educate our officers at John Jay so that if they were faced in that situation, they would feel empowered, no matter what the culture of the organization is, to speak up and say, that is wrong, we don't do that. So I think that is that you've got to look at the cultural piece internally as well as externally in communicating with people.
Thank you, Carol. It reminds me that listening to the two of you reminds me of a conversation Ron and I had a couple of weeks ago where we were talking about policy and culture, and Ron quoted the phrase, "Culture eats policy for lunch." And I've since repeated that to a number of business people, many of whom are listening today. And that's sort of a mantra within organizations, that you can have the pieces of paper, but if you don't have the culture, it really doesn't make a difference. So what I want to do now, Ron, is show a real life example of this. We all know, those of us who are presenting have seen and know a video of a de-escalation taking place in Camden, New Jersey, and with a man wielding a knife and kind of wandering around the city, threatening and endangering people. But the de-escalation policy that was in place it actually worked, because it was not just part of the policy, it was part of the culture. So if we can pull up the video, we're going to show a short clip of how this actually worked in this instance in Camden. And Sharleefi, if we can play the video, that would be great.
Racially charged police shootings like these are causing controversy across the country. But law enforcement experts say many deadly encounters can be prevented with a new type of training.
Sir, drop the knife.
Just because we can use deadly force does not mean that we should automatically resort to it. If there are other options.
The key is de-escalation, says Police Chief Scott Thompson of Camden, New Jersey, which is sometimes called the most dangerous city in America. In other words, don't shoot first. Chief Thompson took me inside his department's tactical headquarters, where officers are being trained to de-escalate confrontations like this.
Sir, drop the knife.
Cops say a mentally ill suspect in Camden is swinging a knife.
A year and a half ago, our officers would have shot and more than likely probably killed this individual. And as he wildly swung the knife, threatening people and walking down the street, we literally just created a little bubble around him.
Police ended up tasing the man, and he drops the knife. He was taken into custody. No one is injured, not the suspect or the officers.
Traditionally, what we train officers is to try to resolve situations as quickly as possible. And oftentimes, that is a recipe for disaster.
So, Ron, I want to come back to a point that you made earlier as we get us up back on the screen. You talked about rewarding the type of behavior and conduct that the department wants. You talked to me a little bit about how one department that you know of actually puts out de-escalation awards. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Right. So the Camden example is a perfect example of culture. And not only did and we know the chief very well. We actually introduced the President's Task Force in Camden because of the great work that they were doing. And part of changing the culture was also setting a policy and a mentality inside the department of recognizing the sanctity of life. That was almost a key value, the sanctity of life, so that it was the obligation then to try everything within reason and safely to de-escalate. So one, you set the values, but then he sent them to train on how to do it, tactically putting a bubble around them, things of that nature. But going back to the reward, I think Camden's one of them, Philadelphia was one, is we typically over the years give officers an award for their bravery after they come off a shootout. In other words, if the suspect had a gun and a weapon, the officer, putting his or her life into risk, I'm reading these citations so often, is now giving this Medal of Valor, which is appropriate. If they did, they basically put themselves into harm's way to save the community, but now they have an equal valued award that says that they use de-escalation. And as a result, they still stopped this armed person. They didn't take undue risk, but they were able to do it without any harm to the community, to the officer, or to the subject. Then once again, now you're telling the officers that the policy that says the sanctity of life is not a piece of paper, because here's the citation, here's the medal, here's the acknowledgement. And when someone doesn't de-escalate, here's the accountability. So that's a perfect example. And this one probably example goes to the issue of policing at the 16,000 department level in the United States. We know we have a gun culture, but here's when you have a significant problem. Put the gun stuff to the side. We also shoot a lot of unarmed people and people carrying edged weapons. So the Police Executive Research Forum, which the chief was a part of, went to Scotland. And they did research saying, well, these guys have a lot of attacks with knives, but don't seem to shoot and kill people. So we followed those tactics. So that, once again, I think the goal for the police department is not just the reduction of unnecessary force. I truly believe that we can reduce greatly all uses of force, even those that are not even questionable and are still, in fact, justified if we remember the sanctity of life, if we practice proper tactics like you saw on the Camden video, creating time, distance, and cover, so that you can slow things down, make better decisions, give people the opportunity to think about, change their mind, and comply, that it will be a lot safer. We shoot and kill over 1,000 people in the United States. And I'm going to go out on a ledge saying that just by de-escalation and focusing on the sanctity of life, we can cut that in half within a short period of time if we really want to do that.
Great. Thanks, Ron. So we do have a question from an audience member, and I think this is a great way. Andy would like you to address pieces of this question, but it's a great segue into Carol. Carol, you often talk about redefining and reimagining what policing looks like. So we'd like you to talk to us about what that even means from your perspective. But before you do that, I think, Andy, it'd be great to have you touch on the question from the audience, which is, can you touch base on the recent vote from the City Council to move forward with getting rid of MPD? Do you see that happening, or does it change the efforts you all are making? And so getting rid of, in the context for you, Carol, then redefining what policing looks like.
Well, I would answer the question like this. The City Council has passed a resolution. Now it goes to the Charter Commission, which is essentially the commission in charge of the Constitution of the City of Minneapolis. And they have to now have hearings and have discussions. I think what we're all talking about today, PJ, Tony, Carl, the four of us, is the need for collaboration on the reimagining of police and on the transformation of culture. And we're really at the very beginning of that process. So what we need to do, in my mind, as a former law enforcement official in Minneapolis and as somebody who cares deeply about the community and about transforming the department, is to have a detailed conversation where we ask some of the tough questions. We haven't gotten to a couple of them that'll come up next. I'd like us to do that. I think that's what people want. And I'm hoping that we have an opportunity to have the conversation and then collaborate on what we, all of us, want from the police department. But with that, I want to hear what Carol has to say about Georgia.
Well, I want to go back to talk about the reimagining and rethinking policing first, and then I'll go back to the question about Georgia. I think that, as I said, as John Jay, which has its origins in the 1960s when we were going through a comparable period of social upheaval, someone had the great foresight to say that we ought to provide our future law enforcement officers with a liberal arts education so they come into the profession understanding sociology, anthropology, these things, so they could be better partners with their community. So today, 50 plus years later, we're at the same moment in history. And so my question is, how am I educating our future officers? What is the role of policing? And I think that, Ron uses a phrase all the time that public safety is not the absence of crime, it's the presence of justice. And so we have to ask ourselves, what does a safe community look like? And what do we need to get there? And what is the role of police in doing that? Because not everything is the role and the job of the police. And police officers will tell you that themselves. We've got them in a position where they're responding to mental health calls that shouldn't be calls they're making. And so the question is, how do we invest in where things ought to be invested so that we have healthier, safer communities where everybody thrives? And so I think the way you get there about rethinking this piece, bringing people together so that you have conversations. And I loved what Carl talked about how they brought the community together to think about what are the core elements and core concepts that they want to see in policing. That's the conversations we need to be having about talking to people on the ground in all the impacted communities and say, what does a safe community look like to you? How does it feel? How does it operate? And then how do we assign the roles of who plays what role to create that kind of world we want to create? But going back to your question about LaGrange, Georgia, one of the things that I think is important, and Carl mentioned in his cultural competency issue, is understanding the communities in which you're policing. So the Chief Dekmar, who's the police chief in LaGrange, and it was in the New York Times when he publicly apologized for the lynching that happened, lynchings, plural, that happened in LaGrange decades ago. He was walking through the police department one day, and he saw two older Black women pointing at a photograph and said, "They killed our people." And he went to an officer who'd been there for years. He said, "What did they mean?" And they said they told the story about when the police allowed someone to be pulled out of their jail and lynched. And so that started a conversation in Georgia and about how do we atone for what's happening, because Chief Deckmar understood that for his officers to understand how the community related back to them, they needed to understand the history. And so while the young officers would say, that happened decades ago, I wasn't responsible for that, but the community remembered that trauma and remembered that the police were responsible for that under the color of law, and that impacted their ability and how they related to each other. So to my great surprise and pleasure, John Jay led College of Criminal Justice led a reconciliation process there in Georgia, where 20 plus police departments did the homework to find out who had been lynched in their communities, found their living relatives, told the story, and apologized to the community. And that's just a first step. That's not going to solve the problems, but it is a step in acknowledging and understanding so that the young officers understand the culture. In Minneapolis, you've got lots of communities and cultures. You've got the Black community, you've got a strong immigrant community, you've got a strong Native American community, and they're all different. And they all have different needs and they all have different voices. And those voices need to be at the table and represented in the conversation as you decide how do we move forward.
Thank you, Carol. I want to address a question that came up about what can people do and where is the business community, because that question was just asked. And I would refer people to recent statements from two of our business community leadership organizations, the Minnesota Business Partnership and the Downtown Business Council, both of whom have put out strong statements calling for transformative change, both cultural and systemic change. It's really a unique moment in time when you have an open letter from police officers saying we are with you to the community. And we have business leaders, small business and large, making the same statement and calling for change. So in terms of what we can do going forward, I would make two suggestions. One, that I think people need to have their voices heard individually and in groups. Our city council and our mayor and our chief and our charter commission are all listening to these issues. We wanted to host this webinar today in part to put forth a message of collaboration and change that is transformative, but also where people are working together. Second of all, we're going to have a series of these webinars. The next ones will, in fact, involve police officers talking with community leaders in small groups. We're also going to address the issue that is on a lot of people's minds about union contracts and how they affect the ability to change a culture in a department. So we're going to go forward with those more webinars. And if you've got an idea about what you want to hear for the next in this series, email us. You'll get the email address at the end. Ask your question now and we'll take it. Ron, I want to go back to the issue that Carol just raised about mental health and that you've talked about. One of the questions, as you two have taught us, that the community needs to address is what kind of police department they want and what they want police department to be doing. We've seen experiments around the country with departments relying on health professionals, relying on crisis intervention teams to address 911 calls. So my question for the two of you is, one, what do you think of those models? What different types of models are you seeing between co-responding or individuals responding just from a non-police sector or police departments that are trained to respond to mental health calls? And then how does that factor in? How does the community, as we think about these issues going forward, how does the funding factor in? Because right now we're hearing about defunding or reducing funding. And when I look at these programs in places like Houston and Eugene, Oregon, and elsewhere, they require funding. And so first Ron and then Carol, can you just give us your thoughts on that?
Thank you, Andy. Before, I was going to say one quick thing about something Carol said. I just want to really highlight this, if I may. I wasn't aware of that project, but one of the things that we haven't done as a country is the truth and reconciliation process, like South Africa. So we've never reconciled our past, and this is why we keep having these problems. So I would just hopefully, Carol, you can expand that program. And I think it was Nelson Mandela that said it best: only the truth can put the past to rest. So getting law enforcement to acknowledge our historical role, our current role, is a necessary first step in reform. With the redefining the police, which you asked that in a different way, or the reallocation, some people call it the funding, put all those terms to the side. And to me, what it takes to look at is the community should sit down and say, what do we want from public safety that Carol mentioned? In other words, not just police, what does a safe community look like? And where should we invest our resources that have the greatest impact on the core causes of crime, the social conditions that cause crime, not the superficial response to the crime? If you do that, then you start understanding that we can start reducing the law enforcement footprint in a community, and that those resources can then go back into the community and social services to sustain it. Now, the question is how much, to what level, which services, and how to do it. So there's varying models, and communities need to sit down and think about it. So on one hand, I would agree, many of the mental health crisis calls we get, the police should not go there. So there'd be one is that if we had professional mental health providers to take those calls, that would be better. More importantly, though, we pretty much deconstructed mental health institutions for the last 30 years to the point the greatest provider of mental health services now are most county jails. So you start providing mental health services, then my officer doesn't have a crisis at 2 o'clock in the morning. But even when he or she does have a crisis, co-responder models work well. Let the professional that knows what he or she is doing be the one to de-escalate, talk the person down. They got the medical history, they know the family. The officer should stand by to just preserve, taking instructions from the mental health worker, right? And I think you talked to Carol's dead right. I haven't met a cop in 30 years that would prefer not to go to those calls that they're not experienced to handle. So there's the co-responder model. There's some where they're not co-responders, but they have 24-hour mental health workers that respond to calls, so that 911 is no longer just dispatching police. They're dispatching police, mental health workers, social services, child protective services, whatever the best response to that problem is. Right now, everything defaults to the police. And I used to say when I was a chief, is we basically, as a community, we take responsibility for this, deconstruct mental health services. A person has to wait 6 months to get an appointment, can't get on their medications. We failed them in that sense. And then 2 o'clock in the morning, they're in a crisis with a butcher knife, and we ask a 25-year-old cop to resolve it and get mad when he or she uses the only tool they got, which is a big hammer. And then you know what they say, if you have a hammer, then everything looks like a nail. So we got to get the police out of this business. We got to get them basically professionals to do that. But the funding part means you have to strategically identify where you make the investments, right? Where you got to reallocate the funds and do so in a strategic manner, not a very just draconian way where you just start cutting and slicing, because you need to show that whatever you're going to invest in is going to have the return on investment for public safety. But in my opinion, these conversations are local. Communities, police, academia, right, with some experts who understand it to really decide, let's take a look what cops are doing, what the police are doing. Should they be doing it? And if not, who? And then how do we then reallocate services for that person or that entity to do the job right and do it safely?
So to build on what Ron said, essentially what we're asking police to address social problems, and criminal solutions to social problems don't work. And so the question is, you pose the question about who ought to respond to calls. There are many successful models. North Carolina, the High Point model is one that works well, where on calls, a social worker goes out on those kind of calls with the law enforcement officers. And I think that, as Ron said, the question is your approach when you encounter these issues. And so it's you're putting an officer in a situation where the leader of the response is somebody who's trained to deal with that issue. It's a mental health issue, as opposed to leading with it being a public safety issue. And that raises all kinds of tensions and it creates an atmosphere where things can go wrong. So again, I think that we've got to figure out, a community's got to identify what are the problems in our community that need addressing, and who's the right person to address those, so that our criminal justice system can focus on the things that ought to focus on, which is people who truly decide, for multiple reasons, not to comply with what standards are to keep a safe community. But there's some things that don't need police engagement at that kind of level. That they would, maybe I should stop. But the whole notion that somebody fell asleep at a Wendy's drive-thru, or was suspected of a counterfeit $20 bill that he may or may not have known was counterfeit. Those don't need heavy-handed law enforcement responses. They're alternatives that we need to address.
Thank you very much, Carol. We actually have another great question from an attendee continuing the conversation about culture. But one question that we have is, what does the fact that only 14 individuals affiliated with the Minneapolis Police Department signed on to the open letter that Andy read earlier to the community tell us about the culture of the larger department and the most appropriate way to move forward productively? So how do you make sure that the culture is transferred and translated throughout the department, and particularly the line officers?
The letter was impressive, but I think what it tells you when you're going to get 14 people in an organization is, in this culture that we're going to talk about right now is not limited to Minneapolis. This is unfortunately the culture of law enforcement in general. And that is not to stand up, not to push back, not to speak out. That's why part of the culture change has to be that duty to intervene. And part of it comes down to is that you're protecting your profession. You're protecting your own reputation. You're protecting the value that your department brings to the community. So it's not surprising at this stage. Now, I think the tragedy of George Floyd is unique, that I've probably heard more law enforcement speak out against the horrific scene that we've seen. But I'm going to push back a little bit. That's too easy. That one is so heinous and so obvious. It's a lot easier to speak out. And I'm glad to see chiefs that are marching and walking. But as I say, if you're going to kneel for George Floyd, now stand and fight for justice. Stand and speak out. Give your voice to it. There's only two types of protests that are unacceptable in our community, and that's silence and violence. And so for the officers, they need to start realizing that silence is complicity, that silence is deadly, and that they need to start speaking out and start recognizing that this is their department. They own this department as far as their sweat, tears, and blood, and they should not allow anyone to bring them down like that. So it's going to take some time for the culture to change to where that kind of speaking out and writing a letter becomes the norm. It becomes expected because people value that culture. So I wouldn't say Minneapolis in any stretch is somehow, by itself on some island, as much as it reflects why law enforcement needs some dramatic reforms. And I don't think changing some of the reforms doesn't go against the idea of reimagining, because there's going to be some law enforcement footprint. Whatever that is, we need to make sure it's still done appropriately and to that and to the best that it can serve the community.
Thanks, Ron. Carol, you want to chime in on that one?
I just love his responses. For those of you who don't know, I have a notebook full of Ron-isms, but I love that the unacceptable responses are silence and violence. That's going into my lexicon. But what it's interesting is I heard Tony say that letter represented the feeling of hundreds of officers. So I'm not sure how to reconcile that with the 13 who may have signed the letter. But I do think that, again, that as Ron has already articulated, that we want to make sure we create a culture where people feel empowered. And I share Ron's view that, we've had too many of these incidents before where people could not have consensus that the behavior was unacceptable. And so the one thing we do have with the George Floyd situation is there's nobody defending that behavior. But we've got to back up from that and redefine what's an acceptable way to encounter the communities law enforcement serve. Because that's what we've got to do, is figure out how do we treat our fellow human beings with and without a badge. And that's a challenge that I'm thankful that I think that our young people are pushing us to face and address. I was on a call 2 weeks ago with President Obama, and he talked about the protest and how do we sustain it. He talked about the young people and the elders, and the elders, those of you who learn from the impatience of youth, because this is a generation who was raised to believe what we tell them, that this country is founded on the principle that everybody has a right to expect to be treated fairly and with dignity. And now they're demanding that. And I am hopeful now that we'll get some sustained systemic change, because demanding, not asking, demanding that we live up to the ideals on which we say this country is based.
Carol, I can't help but take notes when the two of you talk, and I appreciate it. I still have my notes from when we were in the Obama administration. I wanted to pose a question that came from a listener. We talked about the co-responder model and how there are different models around the country. You mentioned North Carolina and others. There are some other practices that we've talked about prior to today, including use of force continuum, and one of the reasonable versus necessary approach. And I'd be interested in the two of you, your reaction to how we think about use of force when you're educating the next generation of police officers, and as you're traveling the country, and as you traveled the country, what you saw during your time in the administration. Maybe Carol, do you want to start with that one?
So I'll start, but I'm going to be piggybacking on Ron, and we made a good tag team in case you can't tell. But he talked about in an ideal world, we won't be starting with teaching them what's an acceptable use of force. Force will not be the default mechanism for people to even think about. And I think that's one of the things that we have to reprogram ourselves about is how do we encounter people, and what's the role in law enforcement when you encounter people and having to decide, am I going to use force here or not? What are the other practices, tools that Ron used that I have in my toolbox? So for me, in terms of equipping the students that I hope will be our future law enforcement officers across the country, because John Jay alums are going all over the country. Thankfully, police departments are recruiting them everywhere, and I hope you continue that. But one of the things I'm re-examining now as part of our curriculum, and it was suggested to us by our Black Student Union, they were very specific about the kind of racial awareness courses that all of our officers ought to have. This moment has given us an opportunity to really understand the language we're all using and really understand what it means. So when we had a big town hall just a few weeks ago, we started with some professors unpacking what is racism, because we use the word, but let's talk about it. What is anti-racism? What are microaggressions that people of color deal with every day that people aren't aware of, and what's that impact on us? Then, but educating the officers to understand these fundamental concepts and principles before we put them out on the street to deal with communities and help support them, but help them have a really strong foundation in what are these core issues that we're all facing. And so then when you have that kind of understanding and foundation, and again, with everything that we do, we've got to be rigorous in testing and seeing how does it work, and not just using anecdotal things and saying, oh, let's try this. Test it, measure it, and see, is there a change in how officers are encountering their communities based on this kind of education? And so my answer is let's not have force at all be the default. Let's equip them to understand what's happening, equip the communities to have the investments where they need to be made so that officers aren't having to deal with social problems that aren't their creation. Then I think that we can have that conversation. But to your point about reasonable force versus necessary force, New York's governor just signed a law that made that distinction. I think that we've got to look at, to the extent we're going to have to look at the force issue, was it necessary? Not whether it was reasonable, but was it really necessary? Because we have an inability right now to really hold officers who cross the line. And I want to say I have great respect for law enforcement. We could not. We need law enforcement. As Ron said, we'll have some sort of system, or we'll have vigilantism, and none of us want vigilantism. That's what happened with Ahmaud Arbery. So we want some sort of system that recognizes and respects everybody. And so I think those are the kinds of things that we need to be thinking about and doing as we have this conversation about systemic change.
Yeah, I think without getting into a legal debate about, the Graham v. Connor case and whether it is objectively reasonable, from my point of view, if it's not necessary, it's not reasonable, period. Especially when you talk about deadly force, right? I think where the debate comes in, when the force is needed, but let's say get to the point, especially with deadly force, not only should it be necessary, in my opinion, it should be the last resort. Now, that means sometimes the last resort could be the first option, but it should be no ambiguity that you had no choice. And that, in that sense, the use of deadly force by the police becomes no greater responsibility than the use of deadly force by a community member defending their lives or someone else, which means I don't, as a 30-year cop, I don't have special powers to take your life. I just have the ability to defend my life and yours in the course of doing the duty. So I think to Carol's point, it's not so much my job is to use force, it's the force is to protect. And so you have the same right when you're inside your house. So it should be necessary. It should be proportionate. It should be the last resort, recognizing that sometimes it's the first options, and it should be always scrutinized from top to bottom, because at the end of the day, as I remind cops, no matter how you slice it, the government just killed a citizen or a community member, and we have the obligation to look at it. But something Carol said is very, very important. The objectively reasonable thing is based on what they call reasonable fear. That word fear is the most vague and dangerous phrase in policing, because if you don't address the issue of implicit bias, that fear may not be real fear, it may be implicit bias, which means if you already have an implicit bias against Black men, then when I reach for my wallet, I'm not reaching for my wallet, I'm reaching for a weapon. If you already have an implicit bias and already have attached criminality because of my color of my skin, then when I ask you why you stopped me, I'm not exercising my First Amendment right and wondering why you stopped me. I'm starting to resist, which is the first sign of aggression. And so when I reach for so all these things, these furtive movements, these he or she was resisting, in many cases is not based on the behavior of the person being stopped, it's based on the outright fear of the officer who's looking at someone and has a stereotype against the person they're stopping. And I don't like to say, I'm not saying that the officer is fearful or cowardice because they wouldn't do the job, but if implicit within you, you have this criminality attached to people of color, then you're going to respond different. You're going to find a lot of uses of force, especially we call them threat perception failures, where you perceive the threat. I thought it was a gun, and it turns out not to be, right? That's when you start knowing you have significant issues that you need to pay attention to. So I would hopefully each state will take this on. California just passed AB 392. I got to give a big shout out for my state and Governor Newsom that also made it a necessity. We also passed 230, SB 230, that requires de-escalation training, implicit bias stuff, duty to intervene. So I think more and more of the states are starting to step up and take this on, and I think that's going to be very good for the profession.
Thanks, Ron. I think we may have time for one more question, maybe two, but at least one. So let's bring it back to the community. For those listeners on the call who are trying to figure out, is this a space for me? If I'm in X field, how can I get involved in this area? And one listener actually asked a question about believing that effective collaboration must include a lot of members of the community, so faith communities in particular, given their prominent role in the community. So as you give advice to the listeners of who from the community, when we say community, what do we mean by that? And what is the role of the faith community? And is there a way to make sure that everyone is working together collaboratively across racial lines in determining the values of law enforcement?
So thank you for that question, because I know that at one point in this conversation, we were talking about voices of the community. There was a reference to community leaders. I think it's important to hear from the grassroots community and have grassroots voices being heard, and individual voices being heard, and how what the form and mechanism is for that will vary from community to community, but I think it's incumbent upon the leaders, whether it's the mayor, the city council, the police chief, to really spend time listening to regular folks in their community, not people with position or power, but regular folks, and hear their issues, hear their fears, hear their concerns, hear their dreams. Because here we are talking about, we're talking mainly problems, but we understand that mothers in any community want to see their children grow up to be on this panel like us. They have the same aspirations as we have for our own children, and we need to refocus in thinking about how do we actualize the ability for them to live out those dreams. And so the church has historically had a role in social movements. And when I say the church, I mean, the Black church, Judaism, all religions have really been key and big social movements. And I'd like to hope, I know that I'm part of a Facebook live streaming that's going to happen next week called Faith and Prejudice, where we're going to the evangelical churches and talking to them about this issue. So this is an opportunity we have right now because people are finally really talking about it. And I have to say this one funny thing. I'm a Carolina Tar Heel to the bone, but I am a supporter of Coach K now because he's on TV on commercials saying, we got to say the words now. Black Lives Matter. And so you got a place where people are saying things that they weren't comfortable saying in 2014 or 2015. And let's use this opportunity. Okay, PJ said, yes, they must be a Dookie. I'm a Tar Heel, PJ. But we've got to use everybody in this conversation. Nobody owns the solution here, but everybody has a voice and ought to be playing a role in it. Like Ron said, if you're not silent, if you're not actively participating and you're silent, then you are contributing to the problem. So as a practical matter, talk to your church, organize folks to go down and have conversations with your police chief, your mayor, your city council. Be active citizens, show up and engage, and go to the council meetings, go to your, whatever community meetings you have, go and speak up and be part of it. And from the leadership side, I know that one of the things that, again, I saw happening in some communities in Georgia, in LaGrange in particular, they became the broker for the conversations between the community and the elected officials, because they had created this trust, such a sense of trust. They had regular meetings with the community where the police department brought the other folks in to address the community concerns, because they finally just decided they trusted the police more than they trusted their elected officials. So I know this can happen, but it takes work, it takes investment, and it takes giving people the room to make mistakes. Because one of the things in our culture is we don't give people room to say the wrong thing. People may say the wrong thing. Keep moving, keep talking, keep engaging, because that's how we're going to have real meaningful change.
I agree with everything Carol said. Let me just add a couple of things with the engagement. You're going to have a webinar later, for example, about unions. One is, I think there's no greater form of police accountability than an informed and an engaged community. And so one of our other colleagues from the administration, Benita Gupta, her leadership conference on human and civil rights put out a publication called The New Era in Public Safety. I like it and participated with it because it's like a technical guide for communities. Things that community members can go up to the police department and go, oh, by the way, let me see, you use the force policy. Do you have a necessary standard? Are you collecting race data? Do you understand implicit bias? Do you provide procedures? In other words, you can start informing the community to hold people accountable. But let me say what I think the community can do. It goes back to redefining the police. Well, before I get into that, if the community is engaged, then you may demonstrate when there's a tragedy, right? So there's 100,000 people demonstrating, but you also need to know that when it's time to pass the union contract, there's 2 people in the audience. So maybe you need 10,000 at the council meeting as well, so that there's no provisions in the contract that would inadvertently or not inadvertently impact accountability. But the greatest thing I think the community can do is set reasonable expectations for your police department. The greatest conflict that I had as a police chief and as a cop for 30 years is that when you basically hold me accountable strictly for crime, then you're going to get a result that we're in right now, which means if you're sitting there telling the police chief, hey, crime doesn't go down fast enough, you're fired. Then the only way for me to make crime go down in that manner is to basically put a bunch of cops in the neighborhood with crime, stop everything that moves, and your crime goes down. But you and I know it's not going down. So set reasonable expectations, make law enforcement a part of public safety, not the whole response to it. This is community members. When crime goes up, then we respond as a community. That means there's social issues, there's economic issues, there's educational issues that cause crime to go up. When the Baltimore police commissioner was fired, and at the time the mayor said homicides didn't go down fast enough in 6 months, you have got to be kidding me. You got over 20% unemployment rate, bandit houses all over the community, and your response to violence was the chief? That sends a very wrong message, and that makes officers wondering, today you're mad at me because there's a video. 3 months from now, when it's a spate of homicides, you're starting to protest saying that we're not doing anything. So reasonable expectations, maintain it, and define the role that police actually have in public safety and hold them accountable to that. Right now, I don't blame the community because we're the ones that sold the false narrative to begin with that we can reduce crime all by ourselves. So we should basically accept responsibility for that as law enforcement. But now for communities, don't buy that. We cannot reduce crime by ourselves. That's why we need to reduce the footprint. There are better services and people that together we can reduce crime together.
Great. Thank you so much, Ron. And thank you, Carol. And Andy is going to wrap us up. We just want to thank all of our speakers, Carl and Tony and PJ as well. And I'll just share this quickly before Andy wraps us up. One thing I shared with colleagues here a few weeks ago is that, each of us still has the breath in our bodies that George Floyd had taken away from him. And each of us still has the breath that Minnesotans like Philando Castile and Jamar Clark no longer get to take. And I firmly believe that as long as we're breathing, we can not only make a difference individually, but collectively, we could work together. The hope is that we can bring new solutions to old problems. And so thank you all for being willing to engage in this. And Andy, I'll turn to you to take us home.
So thank you to Ron and Carol. Thank you to Tony, Carl, and PJ, and to you, Shirlethia. It's been a pleasure working on this important webinar with you. And thank you to our attendees. I'm gonna give one reference. People have been asking in the questions that have been coming online and in the comments that we've gotten from, particularly from Carol and Ron. People have been asking, how do I engage and who do I talk to? I want to put in one plug here. The State Department of Human Rights, the Minnesota Department of Human Rights, has brought what is generally referred to as a pattern and practice case against the Minneapolis Police Department. They are going to investigate and hear from citizens of Minneapolis about their experiences with the police department, positive, negative, and otherwise. And they're going to issue a report and findings and address many of the issues that we talked about today. I would encourage anyone who wants to get involved to work with them, to communicate with them, and to have your voices be heard with them, as well as the city council, the mayor, the department, your religious leaders and institutions, etc. We also will have future webinars. You'll get an email after this webinar thanking you for joining and participating. I apologize for the technical issues. I will tell you that we had an overwhelming response to the invitation, and some of the issues that we had technically, I think, are a result of that, but smart people are working on it as we speak. I really appreciate everybody coming. We're going to put up a final slide here so that you can see the email addresses of the names of the speakers, and you can reach out to them if you have comments for them or if you want to follow up with them. And as you're scribbling down the email addresses, let me tell you, you're also going to get this in an email following this webinar, so you don't have to memorize it. We're committed to memory. We also are giving you an email address for the Jones Day project that we are working on at the bottom, so you can give us your thoughts and ideas both about this webinar and about future webinars that you would like to see. Going forward, it is our anticipation to address some of the very specific issues that were raised today and discussed today, some of them in a little bit more detail than this webinar gave us, but we want to hear from you as to what you want to learn and what you want to see from this project. Thank you to everybody, and I appreciate your participation and your attendance today.